issues earlier tonight. It's really great to see the room full. So I've got one more question from Bill. What is the story on cover crop effects on SCN? Lots of noise, but what does the data say?
Lots of noise, Bill. Still lots of noise. Folks are taking a look at it. I think it's going to depend on what the cover crop is. So it's going to be whether it's a compatible host or not. And I think folks are still trying to really sort out which ones are which. We're gonna kind of look at this. We're setting out some these larger rye strip plots. I think we might have talked about some of this last week with Rodrigo. And some of what we are going to do this year is pull soil samples there and try to track not only SCM, but other pathogens in those plots. So we may know more, at least out of a couple of site years this year, if we can get some pressure there. So stay tuned, I guess, on that subject.
That lots of noise comment about cover crop seems like a good continuation from last week.
It sure is.
Seems like a cover crop theme. I've got a question here from Nate. Have you done any research looking at the response to Olivo or Saltro in varieties with either Peking or PI88788 SCN resistant sources?
Yeah, that's a good question. We haven't recently looked at these seed treatments with Peking versus PI88788. We have looked at the resistance and susceptible within PI88788. And so, you could see it actually, the both varieties that were in the trial that I showed from Wisconsin this year were both PI88788 resistant. So again, when the populations get high enough, that resistance there in PI88788, that sort of levels out those seed treatments. But it is possible that throwing in some Peking there to battle those higher populations could help augment that, but I am not aware of any direct comparisons, mainly because unfortunately the pickings of commercial varieties with Peking is very, very small. So it's really hard to find varieties with Peking sources.
Out of curiosity, question from me. What are the range of relative maturities you can get Peking in right now?
Ooh, good question. I am not sure where we're at right now. I know a few years back we were looking at some stuff against BSR, so brown stem rot. We were doing some work. We could find some varieties in the 2 to 2.5 range, but I did do a little digging because I was trying to look up the new source of resistance out there, and I did not run across any Peking in at least my cursory look earlier today on the latest varieties out there in that maturity range. So my guess is it's probably in the shorter or maybe slightly longer category, unfortunately.
All right, I've got another question here from Stephen. Have you seen a relationship with an increase in yield, soybean yield, correlated with higher grain moisture at harvest?
So I guess, yeah. I mean, we offset, or we adjust all of our yields to 13% moisture. So I guess if you're asking about the differences there, we do adjust everything. But of course, you would get slightly higher, bushel weights there because of that higher moisture. So I don't know if Sean wants to take that one or not, but
we always adjust ours to 13% moisture as well. So I guess we haven't really thought about it or dug into it, but yeah, I don't think it would really make an effect, because you would get, depending on where you at the elevator, you get docked if you're too high anyhow. So
yeah.
All right. Thinking shatter at the head. So are we seeing increased harvest loss when we drop our moisture at 13 or below before harvesting? If you go out and harvest earlier when things are still really wet, do you get less shatter at the head and then see higher yields?
Well, yes. But then you kind of balance it. I mean, the trouble with soybeans is they can dry down. You can lose, we've been out combine and we can lose 5 points from starting in the morning to the end of the afternoon. So it's really hard on the soybean side of things to play that moisture game. I mean, it's a little bit easier on the corn side, but soybeans can be pretty tough.
All right, well, those are the questions we have in the chat right now. I know, Sean, you have quite a bit of material today, so I'll pass it over to you.
All right, well, good evening, everyone. Again, my name is Sean Conley. I'm the state soybean small grain specialist here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I want to welcome everyone here to our Beans and Bowl session. I'm glad to see so many people come in today, and I'm glad we were having Damon on before me. I typically like to have my colleagues on in front of me so that I can gauge the level of harassment I can give them based on what they gave me. So Damon was fairly nice to me today, so I will reciprocate and be nice to him. Before I start, I always like to thank the Wisconsin Soybean Marketing Board and the growers of both Wisconsin and the Midwest, because I always like to tell people that roughly 85% of my funding comes from grower checkoff dollars. That can either be through the Wisconsin Soybean Marketing Board, the North Central Soybean Research Program, or the United Soybean Board. So again, if it wasn't for the farmers out there supporting research as myself and Damon and Rodrigo, we wouldn't be able to have sessions like this. So I always want to thank the growers for supporting our programs. Okay, so today what I wanted to do is kind of talk about some early season things that we see, because frankly, planting is going to be underway before we even see it. And in fact, we've already got some beans planted in Wisconsin. We had one of our farmers plant some beans on December 10th. So we'll have to see how those come out. So again, it might be a good idea to come and talk about some of these replant decisions earlier than later. Now, if we look at some of the things I'd like to talk about, I'd like to thank Rachel Van from NC State. She's been leading a national effort funded by the United Soybean Board to really get a handle on what these planting date differences mean across the nation. So I'm going to look at a statewide level and a national level, and then I'm going to focus and dig in a little bit more on the state. So if we look here across the state of Wisconsin, we roughly see almost an 11.2% yield difference from beans planted roughly that first week of May to when we're in the end of May. And again, that range is quite a bit across the state of Wisconsin. We've done some work up and around the Spooner, where we're at roughly 0.2 bushels per acre per day yield penalty planted past that May 1 timeframe. Whereas we get down to some of the southern locations, we can get up to that 0.5 bushels per acre per day. So again, statewide, we're looking at 11.2%, but we can see a big range from 2 to 5 bushels every 10 days we delay planting. And one of the things we really want to focus in on when we get asked this question is, when should we start planting? And typically what we recommend is planting based on the crop insurance window. And here in Wisconsin, we try to do the best job we can. If we had an error, let us know, but this is basically what the RMA tells us what their planting date windows are in terms of risk for coverage and insurance. And for most of Wisconsin, that is roughly April 26th. So again, we see some different dates in different parts of the country, but again, we just wanted to kind of focus in on statewide, where we should start thinking about that in terms of when we have crop insurance coverage. But I also want to dig in a little bit more specifically across the state of Wisconsin. And for that, what we see here is my computer locked up. Perfect. Is that right? All right. So I know many of you are familiar with this project, but it's very cool that we were able to get 8,000 farmers from across the Midwest to submit us data. And then we basically have yield data from over 600,000 acres of cropland from the Midwest region. And for those of you that didn't know that Midwest region here, the North Central region, basically occupies 82% of all U.S. soybean production. So it's a huge footprint that we were able to capture. And I think, between myself and my collaborator, co-PI Patricio Grassini at the University of Nebraska, we have probably the largest data set in existence that we know of as public database from all the production practices farmers have been doing over this time frame, which was roughly 2015 through 2018. Okay, so one of the things we're able to do is try and sort out, what farmers are actually doing, because we know if we go into the NASS database, they have been really restricted in terms of the amount of information that NASS collects anymore, and it's really tough for us to know what are farmers actually doing out there. That data is not publicly available. So what we're able to do is break that data up that we received from across the Midwest and get kind of an average planting date. So in Wisconsin and by crop reporting districts, we see in these green sections that on average, farmers are starting to plant that second week in, on average, that second week in May on the western side of the state. And then on the eastern side of the state, we're looking at that third week in May as the average start planting date, okay? So again, just primarily focusing here in Wisconsin, we see that dichotomy between the east and west. And obviously it has to do with soil type and how early we can get in. But again, we want to kind of dig into on this more of a refined idea here of what these planting date differences could do in terms of yield. So again, focus in. I've showed this slide lots of times, and I think it's a good reminder to farmers out there. And if we look here, again, Wisconsin, some of this data, we didn't have a good enough coverage in the north to get as refined of information. But again, some of the stuff that we did at the Spooner Research Farm shows a 0.2 bushel per acre per day yield penalty past that May 1st planting date. But if we get here in this orange coloration, on the southern part and along the western side, that is classified as TED 5R. And in TED 5R, we lose 0.4 bushels per acre per day by delaying our planting date past that April 25th date. So again, every 10 days, we're losing 4 bushels in this TED. If we look on the other side of the state where we have some of this, I don't know what I would call it, calf scour yellow. I don't know what better color to call it than that here in the dairy state, where we're again losing 0.4 bushels per acre per day. And way on the eastern side, where we see some of these farmers on average don't start planting until that third week in May, we're losing a half a bushel per acre per day by delaying planting date. So some of those farmers, and again, I understand it's a heavy red clay soil, it's hard to get dried out in the spring, but if we're delaying planting by 20 days, if we're not starting until that third week in May, we're basically putting 10 bushels of beans that's not going in the bin, okay, just by delaying our planting date. Now, to be clear, I'm not encouraging anyone here to go mud their soybeans in. I think we can see and we've heard about we can have sidewall compaction just as easy on soybean as we have in corn. So again, if I'm not really wanting you to go out and mud this in and cause season-long problems, but if that soil is fit and that soil temperature is decent, and by decent, I'm talking 46 degrees and up. I saw Jim Specht was on here. You might say a little bit cooler, but right around that temperature, then I say you go start putting those beans in the ground. All right. So that's kind of the things we're kind of see. So again, kind of dig into this. And I know one of the things that Damon brought up a little bit earlier was this relationship with early planting and SDS. And there is that relationship. And I would say a decade ago, one of the recommendations from plant pathologists, not the good ones we have here in Wisconsin, but from some of the I states, was you delay planting date, or you delay your planting to avoid SDS. And myself and Damon and one of my former graduate students, David Marbriger, really looked at that fact and proved, even if you have a little bit higher disease incidence, it's still better in profitability and yield wise, putting those beans in early and then treating it with something that we have now, as Damon showed earlier, Saltro or Levo. So I think we got good tools with us to maximize yield and overcome some of these challenges of our early planting day. I want to quickly talk about the physiology behind these increased yields, and it's pretty simple. When we have these earlier plantings, we tend to get 2 to 3 extra nodes per plant. You put 2 to 3 extra pods per node on there, 2 to 3 extra seeds per pod. You just run that math over 100,000 plants per acre. That's where that 4 to 5 bushels every 10 days comes from. So it's actually pretty simple to understand the physiology behind what's really driving these high yields. And I always like to call this free yield. You don't pay anything more. It's to basically go out there and plant a week earlier or 2 weeks earlier, again, if that soil is fit and ready. Now, one of our colleagues down in Nebraska worked up with us on this other paper, Wani, and what we really want to do is look at what's driving these differences. Again, we look up here in North Dakota, where there's 3R, where we really didn't see much of any of a yield benefit from planting early. The reason for that is we do some modeling and understand the water balance up in North Dakota. That soybean crop is basically 3 inches short of water during that pod and seed fill period. So if we run into a drought, like we saw this last year in Wisconsin, we kind of mitigate that advantage of yield, of increased yield from earlier planting. So again, there's some weather that kind of plays into a role, but if you really want to set yourself up for maximum yield, I think we have to start with getting those soybeans in as early as we can if that soil is fit. All right, next topic. Now, if you want to kind of focus in on the next biggest question is seeding rate. So again, from our data set from those 8,000 farm fields and 600,000 acres of data, what we find here is on average, based on a crop reporting district, most farmers in the state of Wisconsin are dropping somewhere between 150 and 165,000 seeds per acre. Here in the central sands, they're a little bit less, and up north, we're still a little bit higher, but for the most part, that's where farmers in Wisconsin are sitting. Now, one of the cool questions we have is, now that we have this technology, if you will, to be able to deal with variable rate technologies, variable rate seeding, how do we put these layers together and how do we make these decisions about what we should be doing for dropping our seeding rate across the landscape? So another sense, if you will, is another big data set, and this isn't the farmer related data, but we were able to capture data from roughly 21,000 farm fields from across the state of Wisconsin, not the state of Wisconsin, 21,000 plots from across the Midwest. You see all of these dots, and even our friends over there in Ontario were able to supply us some data. So we got a good set of data. And unlike the TED format that we were looking at earlier, we kind of went with a cluster analysis. What we're able to do, it's something similar to a TED format, but we're just trying to pool these environments into similar environments where we can make comparisons and in a sense parse out in a high yield environment in the north versus a low yield environment in the south, what would our optimal planting population be, or optimal seeding rate? And these clusters, if you will, were segmented based on soil and weather conditions. So again, we're trying to pool them so it'd be similar so we can make broader recommendations across the landscape. I got just a little math here, but want to let you know that how we did it was we parsed this into low yield environments, which was 15 to 58 bushels per acre. What we considered middle yield environments, 58 to 71, and high yield environments, which was 71 to 111 bushels per acre. So again, in every one of these different regions, what we're going to see is high, medium, and low in each one of those three regions. All right. Now, a couple cool things that really popped out of this, which I found was very interesting. In our high yield situations, it didn't matter in our if we related our early season stand count or our late season stand count, we saw no relationship between stand and yield. And what that tells us in these high yield environments, we have a large range of what we need in terms of have a stand out there that really doesn't reflect of what we planted. In other words, because I thought that was pretty confusing, and it was really confusing in my own head when I said it, we could see if we have a percent stand of 100,000 all the way to 200,000 plants out there, very similar yield in a high yield environment. Okay, that was probably a little bit more clear. Where we start to see a break and a significant difference is in these low yield environments. In these low yield environments, we see a much higher relationship between yield and stand. And what that effectively tells us is that in a lower yield environment, we need more plants out there to maximize yield. And that's a little bit different than we think about on the corn side of things. We generally think on the corn side, we have a lower yield environment, it could be droughty soils, whatever, we tend to drop our seeding rates. Or on the flip side, on soybean, we tend to see a relationship where we need more plants out there, a higher percent stand in order to maximize yield. All right. So I'm going to walk you through a couple of these figures. The first one we're going to be talking about is agronomic optimal seeding rate. And what this is what for a given cluster and yield environment, you need to drop in order to get 99% of maximum yield. All right, that's how we could have done this for 95%, we could have did it for 90, but for this, we really want to shoot at 99% maximum yield. So in cluster one, which would be northern Wisconsin, North Dakota, northern parts of Minnesota, we see that to maximize yield, to get 99% of maximum yield, we need to drop 237,000 seeds per acre. Whereas we get down to cluster three, high yield environment, we're dropping roughly a bag an acre, 142,000 seeds per acre. Okay, so this is agronomic optimal. Now, as a farmer, we're generally thinking about economic optimal. So let's take the next step and pay attention to what's going on here in cluster one, low yield environment. we drop from 237,000 seeds per acre drop to 133,000. So we basically shaved 100,000 seeds per acre off a drop in a low yield environment up here to be able to maximize our economic profitability. In the short, if you look at this, I know there's a lot of variability, but really there's not that much. I mean, we can't really fine tune soybeans that much. I would stick with our previous recommendation, and I think Damon would hopefully agree with this because we've been talking about this. You buy a bag an acre, okay, 140,000 seed count. In the high yield environments where you have high risk of white mold, in those environments, you drop 120,000, 115,000. On the flip side, you have a clay knoll, you have a sandy part. You know, if you want to put your prescriptions in, then you take those 20,000 from the good parts of the field and you slap them on the bad parts. So be dropping 160, 165. And I think that's a quick and dirty way to be able to go out, quickly make some prescription maps and make your life easier. And you can even do it on the fly as you go through. This figure right here, again, we're talking about agronomic optimal seeding rate. And what I always like to do with farmers is give them a risk matrix. And what I mean by that is every farmer has their own level of risk. I know my grandma was pretty low risk, what I thought she was, because she really never gambled. She never really did much. And as soon as she retired from the farm, then she started going to the casino every weekend. And I asked Grandma, why are you doing this? She goes, every day was a gamble on the farm, and now I need that edge at the casino. So obviously, I did not get any inheritance, but that's okay. I'm just joking. Anyway, back to the topic here. So how you read this slide right here is the agronomic optimal seeding rate at cluster 1 in a high yield environment is 154,000 seeds per acre. If you increase your seeding rate 10%, there's a 54% chance or probability that you're going to increase yield. All right. On the flip side, if you drop your seeding rate 10%, there's a 40% chance that you're going to increase yield. That's a probability. So again, I like putting these out there for farmers to kind of look at the risk level and understand where they might lie. So one of the quick advertisements I want to give for the Wisconsin Soybean Marketing Board, and I know they've been very supportive, Damon as well, from his apps, from Sporecaster and Spore Buster. This is BeanCam. It's free to download, supported by the Wisconsin Soybean Marketing Board. And what you can do, it's either on the Android store or on the Apple store. Go in, just download BeanCam. You do a little bit of calibration because every camera is a little bit different. You go in then, you set a field name, you figure out what the growth stage is, you put your row spacing on, and you line your camera up on these rows and you take pictures. Very simple. Here we see, this is V1 soybean, 15-inch rows. This is what your camera sees. This is what the app sees behind the background. So again, it's pretty simple and straightforward. This is one of my graduate students, Mary and Lund, former grad students, going out there and doing some work on the calibration side of this. And it was a pretty simple program to run. You go out and snap 5 pictures, and then it gives you an average count. Right here, it gives you your estimated population. This app would estimate you have 80,000 plants per acre out there. And at this population, you're at 97% maximum yield. All right. So we do give farmers, crop consultants an opportunity or an option to be able to go and put a replant rate out there. In that case, it's 60,000 seeds per acre. And if you go in and drop 60,000 seeds per acre into this existing stand of 80,000, you go from 97 to a whopping 98% maximum yield. So again, the point here is that these suboptimal stands, you really don't need to take your time or spend your time, if you will, making replant decisions. And we kind of did some work at another research station looking at these replants. So this is kind of busy and hard to read. I'm going to walk you through this pretty quickly because I talked too fast to begin with. So how you read this figure is obviously here's yield, here's initial seeding rate on the bottom, and here's a replant rate on the top. So these gray bars, we dropped 100,000, 120,000, and 140,000 seeds per acre. We did not come in and fill in those stands. Okay, we really see no yield differences between 120 and 140. These blue bars are 80,000. We dropped 80,000 seeds per acre. Okay, we came back and didn't fill it in at all, or we came in and spotted in 60,000 plants into the existing stand of those 80,000 seeds that we dropped. Here we do see a significant yield increase. It's roughly 2 bushels. I would argue it's pretty hard, even if you get free seed. Again, maybe not at $14 beans, $28. I guess I make that call to the farmer if they think they can go in and replant seed, pay for equipment, time, fuel for 2 bushels. So again, that's why we put these charts out there. Farmers can do it cheaper than that. They think they can make profit, go ahead and do it. We generally say don't recommend it until you get under this 50,000. So our recommendation is on most soils, early planted, all you need is 100,000 plants per acre out there to maximize yield. Between 50,000 plants and 100,000 plants, you don't touch it. I'd rather have you invest any dollars into a residual in-crop herbicide to control water hemp. I think you'd be way better off, because we've done some work and I've got plenty of pictures to show that, yeah, even a stand of 50,000 plants per acre will fill in, but it takes a week later and you'll get that 90% canopy, which will stop weed emergence and growth. So anyway, okay, so what I'm going to do is quickly run through this, and I know I'm not going to do this justice or time. That's okay, because we're still sorting this data out. This was a project looking at, are precision planters necessary for profitable soybean production? Okay, that's kind of a question. We hear this a lot on the corn side. You need a picket fence. What about the soybean side? How important is that to have that perfect plant-to-plant stand out there? So we have 2 different projects. I'm going to focus on the equipment one mainly, because that's probably the more interesting one. And what we want to do is look at 2 different systems. Okay, we went in, we looked at 2 high yield potential varieties we picked from a variety trial, a 2.0 and a 2.5 maturity. So we had different genetics out there. We did this on 30-inch rows to kind of look at that comparison, look at that system. And we had 2 different planters. We had me out there with a random drop cone planter. Basically, the seeds could be stacked all together, and that's not that bad, but it's random drop, versus this precision vacuum planter, where those seeds are precisely planted as well as the system can do. So these are our 2 systems. All right. Next, we went out and did these different seeding rates. So we went and dropped in increments of 20,000, 40,000 seeds, 60,000, 80, 100, 120, 140, and 160. Okay, that's the seeding rate range, and this is over 2 different years, a couple different varieties. And how you would read this is the blue bar is the random drop cone planter. The orange bar is the precision planter. All right. So I do want to make a couple caveats. I wanted to make this in the last slide. Again, this is just 2 planters, one precision system, 2 years. I mean, this is not the gospel, but I think it helps us, frame up what I thought has been going on this time. All right, so back to the data. We see no difference between a precision and random drop at 160, 140, 120, 100, or 80,000. Basically, the yield was similar across all of these. You see they all have A's on them. It's not until we get to 60,000 that we saw a difference between where the seeding rate drop. And again, this is all early planted stuff. We were out there in the first week, 10 days of May, so that's where we're focusing all of our work. I would expect probably maybe a bigger difference in later planting. Now, the interesting thing is we get down to 40,000. So we did not adjust for germination. We physically dropped 40,000 seeds per acre. And this is the only point where we saw a differentiation between a random drop and a precision planter was at 40,000 seeds per acre. Again, it'd be nice to have an ag engineer do some of this work, but I'm pretty confident that this is sorted, because I had seen some earlier data. This had been probably 5-10 years ago from Argentina, and they didn't see a split down to 60,000. That's why we decided to put that down to 40. So again, just use this as you will. And I'm sure if you already have the equipment, go ahead and use it. We don't really see a difference in terms of the seed singulation or the precision planting. But there it is. There's the data we have. Yeah, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. The biggest point I want to make, and I think we all aware of this, is once we really start thinking about dropping these soybean seeding rates, really low. I've talked to some farmers that are going to do some experiments this year. They're going to be dropping 120, 160, 80, 60. I think they're as low as they were going to go 60. One of the challenges we have to remember, though, is when we get below some of these 100,000 seed drop is where those where we can have that pod placement. And at this 50,000 seeding rate where we were doing these counts, we had basically we averaged 2.3 pods per plant were below that 3-inch number. So we kind of picked that as an arbitrary number. But again, understanding how your combine is set up and where that cutter bar lies, we need to make sure we rely on that as well to help to keep, at least be able to harvest all of that seed that we grew out there. This figure is confusing, but I'll kind of walk you through it. So here we are. These are our hand planted trials, just looking at yield and placement. So this was our yield this is our relative seed yield on a percent basis at seeding rates of 50,000, 80,000, 110,000, and 140,000. All right, which is we expect. As you increase your seeding rate up to some point, you level off, and you hit 100% max yield. The cool thing is this figure right here is that at 50,000 plants per acre, half of your yield is on the main stem, and half of the yield is is basically on those lateral branches. And some of the work that we did with this decade study, I've mentioned this a few times, is where we planted soybeans that were from the 1920s all the way up to, I think it was 2014. We see that in today's modern genetics, we put 3 times the amount of yield on branches as we did 30 years ago. So this kind of echoes that fact that at these low populations, half of our yield is coming from those branches. So I think that's pretty cool to understand why our yield penalties aren't as bad as they were 20, 30 years ago. So with that, here's my website, coolbean.info. There's my Twitter, @BadgerBean. And I think I'm only 1 minute over, which is pretty darn good for me. So with that, I am going to, I'm going to stop here. Emma, you can make the announcement.
Oh, about CCA numbers, or is there some secret other announcement?
No, the QR code is posted.
QR code is posted, and if you want to drop your CCA number in the chat for those of you that don't use the app, you're welcome to do so. We'll be sure to record any numbers that come up in the chat. And with that, I do have quite a few questions for you, Sean, so let's get started. I've got a question here from Fred. Explain in detail why a date of April 26th is the minimum date.
Well, I just use that date because that's where we can have crop insurance. I mean, I'm just going to stick with that date. If we're not being recorded, we can talk a little bit about something else at a different time, but that's why I use that date.
I like the logic. I've got another question here from Fred as well. If you use an early planting date, should the farmer change their relative maturity for soybean?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would generally say yes. We like to push, relative maturity in soybean is, it's an imprecise art. Every company has their own internal system. A 2 bean in one company would be a 2.5 or a 2.6 in a different company. So you have to understand that this is an imprecise science. But generally what I would say is if you're pushing your soybean in the north, they don't always agree with this sentiment in the south, but in the north, if you plant earlier, I would recommend pushing your maturity group out a little bit longer. Unless you want to plant winter wheat, then you need to get it off a little bit quicker so you can get winter wheat planted on time. But good question.
Yeah, it makes sense. We've got another great question here from Vince. Were yield environments grouped based on historical data or post hoc analysis? This question came in while you were talking about the seeding rate trial from the multi-state.
Yep. So that one would have been post hoc analysis because in some of these places I didn't have a long-term yield history, but that's a good question.
All right, I've got another question from Fred. What is the maximum yield per acre for soybeans for southeastern Wisconsin?
So I would argue, and I know Jim Speck from Nebraska is on here, so he might disagree with me. And if he does, it will be a 7-page email that I will get later this evening. And in fact, Jim, even when you do agree with me, it's a 7-page email. And I don't know if you agree or disagree. So I just had to, I like Jim. He's a good guy.
It might be longer if you're wrong.
Thanks, Jim. What was the question again? I was too busy thinking of Jim.
What is the maximum yield per acre for soybeans in southeastern Wisconsin?
I would say we're right in that 118, 120 bushels. That's, what our maximum, that's where I would put us at, is right in that 118, 119. If you look at the models, right around in there.
All right.
I'll agree with that, Sean.
Thanks, Jim.
So we're down to a 5-page email. Just a reminder for folks, you can use the QR code to get your CEUs with the CCA app or put your CCA number in the chat. We'll be sure to record those. If you use the app, you do not need to provide your number in the chat. It's an either or kind of thing. And then I've got another question here from Troy. Was the precision gear an exact emerge with the brush delivery system for the spacing trial?
That is a good question. And I don't know the answer. Could you email it to me? That would be an equipment question for John Gaska. So John, if you're on, feel free to put it in chat. I don't remember off the top of my head.
Also, this is a question from me because I'm curious. What was the planter speed for that trial?
It would not have been fast. It would have been in that 3 to 5 miles per hour. It wasn't, that 10 mile an hour, whatever the max speed is.
Yeah, I just see more difference in the accuracy with the brush delivery when you're at those higher speeds. So at the low speeds.
And I said it was. I want to make sure I'm clear that I didn't say that was a perfect trial, but it was something that I hadn't seen before. So any feedback, feel free to let me know. Or if anyone has any equipment and wants to put it to the test, let us know. I'll be glad to do large scale stuff with you next year.
Sean, John did answer that question in the chat. The Deere Exact Emerge was a vacuum planter with a soybean seed plate. We use that for the plant spacing trial.
Perfect.
All right, I've got another question here from Fred. What was the max of soybeans in Wisconsin in 2020? I assume that's max yield.
Yeah, so we had a yield contest winner that was 105 bushels per acre. Right around that time. I don't remember the exact number, but we had plots went 100, but in terms of a 1.25 acre stretch that we measured, and it's in the Wisconsin Soybean Marketing Yield Contest, it was 105 bushels per acre. And I think if we wouldn't had that dry spell in August, it would have been greater. We took, on average across the state, specifically more so in the southeast part, I bet we took 3 to 5 bushels off the top end, because of that stretch of dry weather.
All right, I've got a question here from Bill. Do we need to identify seed spacing when making replant decisions at low populations?
It's really hard to do that. We actually went and tried to measure the variability in our plant-to-plant spacing. That's really tough to do. And again, remember on the soybean side of things, we have that branching that we can really overcome these larger gaps. And I would say no. Obviously, if you have big holes or big gaps up that are obvious, but we've tried to get a sense of that variation and plant-to-plant variability, and it hasn't been very predictive, at least from the data set that we have.
All right, you're caught up on questions. I'm going to let people type some more for a second. And give one last reminder to register for next week. You can do that at badgerbean.com. Thank you all for being here. And Lindsay and John have provided some more information about the planter from the Exact Emerge trial. The plot lengths were adjusted so that the planter was at a consistent speed for all of the plots. And they trimmed the plot where the planter got up to speed and did not use that as part of the data set. That was a really efficient question and answer session. I was impressed by how many questions you got through that quickly.
Well, when I don't know the answer to half of them, it goes a lot faster.
You got most of them. There was only one pass to John. All right, I've got a question here from Ryan. What was seed spacing for low population study?
That's a good question, Ryan. I'll have to go back and look in the data. I don't know. We did measure that. I don't know if we reported it on that slide, and it will be in the paper. We're currently writing a paper on this project, and we'll have an extension web page or an extension article posted on CoolBean. But we do have that data. I just don't know it off the top of my head.
All right, well, it's getting quiet in the chat. These were two great talks. Thank you so much for being here today. Any last minute announcements?
No, just thanks everybody for your patience while we got set up. Next week, we'll do some things to simplify it. I promise you that. And I think we got through enough technical challenges for all the rest of our sessions. So again, appreciate your patience with us tonight. Thank you guys. Great job, Damon. Great job, Sean.
Hey, Damon, a question just popped up. Hey, I can answer that one for Andy while Damon reads the one from Jim. What is the population of gray hairs in my beard? It's pretty high, and it's getting greater every day. So I just have a daughter that turned 14, so it's gonna keep getting grayer.
Yeah, Jim, we Sean and I with David Marburger, he talked about David when we were doing some of the planting day work, and he also looked at variety resistance at that time. Of course, varieties have changed significantly. I think, what was that, 2016, 17, Sean, we did all that work. But
yep.
Part of what David was doing was looking at ratings within the companies for SDS and trying to evaluate whether they were really truly resistant or not. And this is one of the cases where the ratings within the companies were actually pretty accurate as long as they were skewed towards the more resistant end of the company's scale, if that makes sense. So in other words, if that SDS rating was sort of in the middle of the pack, the resistance could go either way. But if it was skewed more towards the resistant end of that company's scale, then those were generally truly resistant varieties. And so we've seen that improve, I think, even in some of these newer varieties, but now the variety changes so fast, it's so hard to keep track of it. But I still do see decent varieties coming through.
Okay, thanks for the info.
There's a question from Clark Reamer. Any work being done at drought-tolerant soybeans? Actually, Jim, as a soybean breeder, you probably know more about that. If you don't mind, we love having Nebraska on here because we get to beat you in football every year. So we'll give you a chance.
That's why I'm here to learn. I need a couple of linebackers like you guys down here in Nebraska. Yeah, George Graff is working on that at Nebraska. He has a nice system and where he sends his lines down to Chile in the winter nursery where they don't get rain down there. And they're able to use a managed water environment to test the yield response of his breeding lines to additional amounts of water that are timed at different stages. And for that reason, he gets to be able to combine good drought tolerance with his irrigated yield response. So that's pretty good. And really what you need, at least based on work from Illinois, is varieties that actually will transpire better when the rains do come and you get wet soil. So you want high stomatal conductance on the days when there's water available to transpire, even though they're called racehorses because they gain radiation use efficiency. That's a big term, and I don't want to make my answer too long here, but that's the kind of drought tolerance we're looking at, is the ability of soybeans to adjust their stomata as the new varieties do, that keep their stomates open right after it rains, and you get a lot of photosynthesis going on for a few days longer than you would with typical old style drought tolerant varieties. So yes, there's some breeding going on. So, and George is a leader in that right now. So.
I got one more question that was very interesting, but I want to make sure that we make time for Kurt's question as well. Any adjustment to seed depth in relationship to planting date?
So this is where Jim Specht and I totally disagree. If he goes early, he wants you to sink those beans in, I think, a foot. No, not that. We generally, if you're really planting ultra early, you should probably stick them in a little bit deeper, 1.5 to 2 inches, but I know Jim has shown some work from Nebraska where they're putting them down, I think, as far as 3 inches, but I'm not,
Not
we
that
might,
deep.
we might hit the frost line in Wisconsin if we go 3 inches deep with our earlier planting. So
No, our recommendation is between 1 3/4 and 2. And I used to think shallower was better on early planting too. But the problem is that in the shallower situation, your soil moves a little closer up and down temperature wise as it does to the boundary layer with the atmosphere. So having it just a little bit deeper, soil doesn't move as much temperature wise or fluctuate day and night. So having a little deeper in the spring actually doesn't hurt it. The biggest problem is always, as Sean would point out, is crusting. So you have that particular problem, which can be a disaster when you're down 2 inches. But if you don't mud them in like he talks about, you should be in great shape.
Does your depth recommendation for early planted beans change based on soil texture?
Was that a question to me or Sean?
I think that was you, Jim.
That was totally to the panel. I'm enjoying the multiple perspectives. Agronomy by committee.
I always say just get yourself a meat thermometer, put it out in that field you're going to plant. If it's 50 and it's going to stay that way for the next 24 to 36 hours, plant. If it isn't, wait until it has a 2-day warming period. That imbibition period, the first 24 to 48 hours, is all you need to worry about. Soybeans, after they get past that imbibition phase, will germinate and go on freely in the osmotic period, even if the soil temperature gets down to 35. It's just the first chilling injury period that you need to worry about. So
there's a pretty good chance that I
they don't come up very quick, but they'll come up.
There's a pretty good chance I said temperature. I definitely meant texture.
I guess I didn't quite hear that one.
Do they change based on soil texture?
Oh, texture. I'm sorry. I don't have much to say about that relative to planting. How about you, Sean?
No, to me, it's irregardless. We plant same depth and sand, silt, or clay.
Yeah.
And that's where we stick it.
Yeah.
Nice. And then I've got one more question for Jim here on the chat. Does higher stomatal conductance during wetter times encourage deeper rooting depth to handle drier times?
Stomatal aperture is really dependent on the evaporative demand. They're only open during the daylight, of course, and it depends on what the vapor pressure deficit is. By that, I mean the relative humidity. And so soybeans are very much attuned to atmospheric conditions. And I'm not sure about deeper rooting depth. We know from our work that soybeans head down, the taproot heads down at a rate of about a 1/2 inch per day, unless it hits some hard pan that's going straight down, and about 4 inches behind the tip of that taproot, you have lateral roots come out. So unlike corn, soybean, sends down a taproot, and it goes down. I see a lot of reports where they think soybean roots are not so deep. They're as deep as corn, if not deeper. When we did our study, they went down to 5 foot in dry years. So and extract water from the 4th foot, especially the early planted beans in dry years.
Well, I appreciated both talks and all of the Q&A session. Thank you to our attendees for some great questions today, to our 2 speakers, and Jim for some really excellent thought-provoking answers. Thank you to Todd for getting all of the technical side of things worked out today. This went really smoothly once we got started. And I appreciate everybody attending today. Just one last reminder to sign up for next week at badgerbean.com.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.